Okay, welcome to the Impala shirt tutorial. I've got my pieces cut out and on the table just to show you guys the notches that we need to do before we start constructing. So we'll start on the front. We've got two fronts mirrored. So the notches that you need are for your front placket, and they'll be 2.5 centimeters wide. So make sure you pop those on. Your front armhole notch, and then obviously for the other side mirrored. And then we've got our back piece, which is cut on the fold. So we've got our pleat notches here to make sure that you've done 2 on one side, your center back, and then 2 on the other side, and then you'll mark this point. The 2 double notches for the back sleeve. So that's the back piece. And then the collar piece, I haven't actually popped the notch on, but I will notch the center so that it's easier to align. Okay, so for our collar stand, we've got a few notches to pay attention to. So mark your center, and then the shoulder notch, and then where our collar is going to meet our collar stand, and also where it's going to meet our placket. Then you've got 2 cuffs. You don't really need any notches for that. And then we've got our yoke. So for our yoke, we've got the center notch, the shoulder notch, and then this one is really important to have. That's going to be our new shoulder center notch, and that's where our sleeve is actually going to meet when we insert the sleeve. So that's going to line up the middle of the sleeve to this notch here. So make sure that you transfer it to both yokes. And then for our sleeve pieces, we've got just the classic front notch, middle notch, and the back notch. But then also for your sleeves, you're going to transfer the pleat notches so that you can just do that with like longer lines, longer notches here, and make sure you've got that on the mirrored piece here. Okay, so our first step is going to be sewing our inverted pleat on our back piece. So that will be sewing from the top of your notch down to this point here. Once we've sewn that line, we'll then open up our back piece and then press this piece flat. But I'll show you that a bit closer when we get up to that step. Okay, now that we've sewn this line, we're going to open our back piece up. And what you'll get is this shape here. And what we're going to be doing is pressing this flat so that forms a box pleat. And the box pleat is going to be your wrong side, so the inside of the shirt. And you can use your notches here to get your box pleat nice and accurate. And then we're just going to baste that in place. So you can baste that within the seam allowance. And that's going to be our right side, and that's going to have the nice inverted pleat. So I'm just going to go and baste that in place, and then we'll move on to attaching the yoke. Okay, we're going to be moving on to attaching the yoke to our back piece. So we'll just grab one of them, and with right sides together, we'll be just matching up the notches. So the center to the center back, and then matching the edge to that edge, and then this edge to that edge. So I'm just going to go get my pins and do that. Okay, now that I've pinned one yoke to the right side, we're going to flip it over and we're going to sandwich the back piece with the other yoke. And we're going to do the exact same process by aligning the centers together. And then the edges, and then distributing the ease evenly throughout the middle parts. So now that we've pinned our yokes, you should have your one yoke on the outside, one yoke at the back piece in the middle, and then a yoke on the back. So it should be sandwiched. The back piece should be sandwiched between the 2 yokes. Now we're going to be stitching these 3 pieces together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance along this raw edge. Okay, so I've just sewn these pieces together. Now what we're going to be doing is moving on to ironing the yoke pieces up. So getting them both, ironing both sides. And then once this is all pressed nicely, we can go ahead and top stitch from the right side, which is our inverted pleat, and top stitch along this sewn edge here. Okay, so the back piece is finished. We've just sewn, I've pressed my yoke pieces up and top stitched my yoke from the right side. So now we can move on to the fronts. So we're first going to be using our front placket notches to be making our button placket. So that will be folding and pressing once all the way down, folding it again, and then edge stitching that in place on the wrong side, and then repeat that for the other side as well. Okay, so I've just done my button plackets. So now we're going to be moving on to the burrito method, which is essentially joining our front and backs together using the yoke. So we'll start by placing our back piece down, right sides facing us, with our top yoke up and our bottom yoke hanging down. So it should be poking out at the back there. And then we'll be laying our front pieces, right sides facing together, and joining that at the shoulder line. And we'll be pinning each front piece to the back and just making sure that we're not catching the bottom yoke. So I'm going to go ahead and pin my shoulders together. Okay, now that I've pinned my shoulder lines together from the front and the back, we're going to be folding up our back and our fronts together. So I'm just going to be rolling it up into a small, tight shape. And once you start folding, you'll be able to see that the bottom yoke starts to become visible. And once I get to about this point, that's when I can start the process of flipping our bottom yoke, sandwiching our fronts and backs together, and joining at the shoulder point. So using the reference that we already have of our fronts and backs, we're now going to just be adding this yoke in. And just be careful and work slowly in this process so that you're not catching any of our burrito fabric in there. Then I'll move on to the other side, just repeating the same process. Okay, once the two shoulder points are pinned together, so you should have 3 layers there, and the fronts and backs sandwiched in between, then carefully sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance along our pinned points, just being really careful not to catch any of the front and the back in there. So I'm going to go and do that, and then I'll show you how to flip it all out. Okay, so we've just sewn our shoulder points together. Now the fun part. So you're going to have your neck opening here, and you can essentially just grab the fabric from the middle and pull it out. And then you should have your front and your backs joined together. And it's just such a nice process because it makes the inside of the shirt super clean as well. So that should be your right side with the inverted pleat, and this should be the wrong side with the box pleat. So what I'm going to do now is just give these shoulder points a little bit of a press so that they sit flat. Okay, so now it's time to do our side seams. So we're going to turn the shirt right sides facing together and then joining the side seams here, pinning and then sewing with the 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then finishing the edge with a overlocker stitch or a zigzag stitch, and then just repeat on the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Okay, we're going to move on to our collar. I've decided not to interface my collar because I just prefer the feel and the look, and it's also quite a heavyweight linen that I'm using. So if you've decided to interface your collar, you only need to interface one side of your collar, and that will be the wrong side. So what we're going to be doing now is joining our collars together, and we're going to be pinning from the short edge up to the top and then back down, and then doing a 1 centimeter seam allowance around our collar. So I'm going to go ahead and pin my collars together. Now that I've pinned my collar together, I'm going to use a 1 centimeter seam allowance and join these pieces together from the short side up to the long side and then back down, leaving this bottom bit open. Okay, now that I've sewn my collar pieces together, I'm going to turn it inside out, but before I do that, I'm going to snip these corner edges so that I get a bit more of a clean corner for my collars. So now I'm going to flip the inside out, and then I'm going to use my little tool to kind of get like a sharp corner there. And then what I'm going to do is press the collar together, and then once it's all pressed, top stitch around the edge that we've just sewn. So now we're going to be sandwiching our collar piece together within the collar stand. So we're going to place one of our collar stands down, right sides up, and we've got one collar stand that I've pre-pressed so that in our next step it'll be a little bit easier. So go ahead and pre-press that bottom edge of the collar stand with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Once you've done that, you want to place your collar. Now I haven't actually found the center of this, so I'm just going to mark that, fold it in. And then we're going to be aligning our collar with the notches on the collar stand and joining it at the centers together. And then the notch here on the edge of the placket. I like to just pin my collar to one collar stand and then add this on top with my existing pins. And if you've interfaced your collar, you'll have to ease this in a little bit more, but just take your time because it will fit. It just needs a lot of easing in. So once we've got those 3 points pinned, I'm going to go ahead and place my other collar stand on top and align those edges. Okay, now I'm going to just ease the excess whilst sandwiching my collar together. So take your time with this step because it will fit. It doesn't look like it will, but if you stretch your collar and ease it in, it will fit. And just use as many pins as possible as well to really secure it in place. Okay, so I've pinned together my collar stand. In the middle is my collar, and then my other collar stand here, so it's sandwiched together. Now I'm going to carefully sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance all along this curved edge, and then once I've done that, I'm going to trim these little corner bits a little bit as well, so that it's just like we did with our collar, just to make it a bit more pointy. and then press it all out so that it's a nice smooth collar. Okay, so we've got our collar looking fresh, looking good. Now we're going to attach it to our shirt. So we're going to have our right sides facing us. And we're going to use our notches to help us pin this along the neckline. So we're going to use our center notch. That's going to be our first notch to join. That should be here at the yoke. We're going to obviously pin our raw edge and make sure you're getting both layers of the yoke attached whilst you're attaching the collar. Then my second notch I like to attach first is the edge of the placket. And then aligning this edge as well. And then we're going to do our shoulder points. Making sure to grab both layers of the yoke. We'll pin there. We'll do the other side as well. And then what I like to do is start pinning between this notch and this notch, and then our next couple of notches. So it's really important to start with these notches and not just start the collar on one edge and pinning, because you're going to be pinning your collar to a curved neckline. So it's really important to pin at the notches first and then ease in the excess between those pins. Okay, so now we've pinned the collar to the neckline, and now I'm going to be carefully sewing a 1 centimeter seam allowance along here. I like to sew from this side so that I know I'm not catching any bits of fabric, and just making sure to push the other collar stand out of the way whilst you're sewing. So I'm going to go do that, and then I'm going to press it up, and then I'll show you how to enclose the raw edge. Okay, so we've sewn our collar to our neckline, and now what I've done was I've pressed my collar stand up on the right side, and now we're going to tuck in the raw edges using our pre-pressed edge as a guideline. And now we're going to just be pinning this edge just so that it covers our previous stitch line. So I'm going to go and do that now and pin it in place. And then once you've pinned it in place, you can just edge stitch along that line. Okay, now that I've pinned that in place, I'm going to edge stitch along this edge and enclose the raw seams. Okay, so now we've got our collar stand sewn on. Now we can pop this to the side, and now we're going to work on our sleeves. So the first step we're going to do is pin our pleats. So the pleats are always going to go towards the back. So we're going to get our first round of pleats. What I like to do is pinch it at the edge, use that as my center mark, and bring it over to this notch. We're just going to pin it there, and then do the same for this pleat. Pinch it and align it to the edge. And then you can just base that within the seam allowance, and I'm going to go ahead and do that to this sleeve as well. Okay, once you've basted them together, you can then finish the sleeves. So we're going to be right sides together, joining at the side seam here, pin in place and join with the 1 centimeter seam allowance and finish your edges either with a zigzag stitch or an overlocker. So I'm going to go ahead and do all of that, and then we'll come back to insert the sleeve. Now we're going to insert our sleeve into our armhole. So we want our shirt wrong side facing us and right side is inside. So that when you align the right side, they'll match together perfectly. So with our sleeve, we're going to be doing the opposite. We want the right sides facing us. And then we're going to find the corresponding sleeve so that the notches match up. Okay, so I'm going to start by inserting the sleeve and matching the side seams and pinning in place. And then I'm going to move on to the front notch, pin that in place. And then I'm going to do the center shoulder notch. So that's going to be the center notch on my sleeve and then the shoulder notch on the yoke. So that's the one that we did previously, that we marked previously. And then the last notch will be the back sleeve double notch. And then once you've pinned at the notches, then you can go around and ease the rest of the sleeve into the armhole. If you feel like you have a little bit of excess in your sleeve that you need to ease in, you can always add a basting gathering stitch if that will help you gather it in. But if you align at the notches, it should have the correct amount of ease to ease in between the notches. Okay, now that that's all pinned in place, I'm going to sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then I'm going to overlock and finish the edge, and then I'm going to repeat that whole process for my second armhole. Okay, so I've just attached both sleeves. So now we're going to move on to the cuff. So for the cuff, we're going to press the cuff lengthways to get that middle line. And once that's pressed, to join it right sides together and join at the short edge and join with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And then once you've done that, opening up the seam allowance, ready to attach to our sleeves. Okay, so I've got my cuff. It's joined together at the short ends, and then we've got our reference line in the middle. So now we're going to align the cuff at the side seam, and we're going to have the wrong side of the sleeve facing us, and it's the right side of the cuff is going to slip over the wrong side, just like this. And we're going to align it at the side seam here and put a pin in place. And then we can go around and pin the rest of the cuff around our sleeve hole. Just easing in the sleeve into the cuff. Okay, once you've got enough pins in, you can attach with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Once you've done that, you can then flip your cuff outwards and press it out, and then I'll come back and show you the next step after that. Okay, so I've attached my cuff, flipped it out, pressed it away, and pre-pressed my raw edge in. So now the last step to finish off our cuff is to use our pre-pressed middle line as our guide and to fold over the cuff and just covering our previous stitch line. Okay, so I've just finished off the cuff. So that's what it looks like. And then your last or second last step is to hem your shirt. So that's using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Because it's a bit of a curved hem, if you're having troubles having the hem lay flat, you can start with a 1 centimeter line of stitching and then use it as your guide to press your hem up. And then obviously once you've pressed it once, enclosing it a second time and then edge stitching along. And then your last step will be adding your buttons and buttonholes. So that's just dependent on your sewing machine and your preference with buttonholes. That's the end. We've done an Impala shirt. Thank you so much for joining me and for sewing along with me. And I hope you get lots of years of joyful wear.